Just about 48 hours ago, right now, I was in a dental chair before an oral surgeon. I woke up Friday morning thinking that there was an ice pick in my jaw. Thanks to 3 different dentists, all of whom attend this church, Dr. Tyler Ferris, Char Ferris, and Dr. Stephen Buckley, I was informed that something needed to come out. And so the good news is I was able to put our little teaching series to the test, because just as I leaned back and they put the gas on my face, the last thought I had was, I'll get through this. It won't be quick, and it won't be painless. So if you don't like the sermon, you can blame them. If you do like it, you can blame them too. You have an outline in your handout if you'd like to pull it out and follow along. If you're watching online, I invite you to click the YouVersion button. Join us online. Welcome to all of you in the overflow rooms. May God's blessings be upon you as well. We're going to open our Bibles to Genesis 39. After we say a prayer, we'll get right to work. For your mercy that kept us all week, we give you thanks, and for your mercy that sustains us even now, we bless you. Forgive, please, the sins of the one who speaks. They are many. And may we see Jesus and just Jesus. Through Christ we pray. And all the church said. A middle-aged couch potato received a gift from his wife, a week of private workout lessons at the local health club. His trainer was Tanya, a 26-year-old aerobics instructor and athletic clothing model. He documented the outcome in an exercise diary. Day 1. Started the morning at 6 a.m. Tough to get up, but worth it when I arrived at the health club and Tanya was waiting for me. She's something of a goddess, with blonde hair and a dazzling white smile. Tanya was very encouraging as I did my sit-ups, though my gut was already aching a little from holding it in the whole time I was talking to her. This is going to be great. Day 2. Took a whole pot of coffee to get me out the door, but I made it. Tanya had me lie on my back and push this heavy iron bar up into the air. And then she put some weights on it. Legs were a little wobbly on the treadmill, but I made it. Her smile made it all worthwhile. Muscles feel great. Day 3. The only way I can brush my teeth is by laying the toothbrush on the counter and moving my mouth back and forth over it. Driving was okay as long as I didn't try to steer. Tanya was a little impatient with me and said that my screaming was bothering the other club members. Day 4. Tanya was waiting for me with her vampire teeth in full snarl. I can't help it if I was an hour late. It took me half an hour late. It took me that long just to tie my shoes. I hid in the men's room until she sent Biff looking for me. Day 5. I hate Tanya. I hate Tanya more than any human being has ever hated any other human being in the history of the world. If there was any part of my body not in extreme pain, I would hit her with it. She thought it would be a good idea to work out my triceps. Well, I have news for you, Tanya. I don't have triceps. Day 6. Got Tanya's message on my answering machine, wondering where I am. I lacked the strength to use the TV remote control, so I watched 11 straight hours of the Weather Channel. Day 7. Well, that's the week. I'm so glad it's over. Next year, maybe my wife will give me something a little more fun, like a root canal or a kidney stone. You've likely never met Tanya, but you have met the teacher who drilled you, or the band director who pushed you, or the coach who challenged you, or the sergeant who all but killed you. Where do they get these kind of ideas? Well, somewhere along the line, they learned this principle, and that is tough tests toughen people. Tough tests toughen people. Long before a coach planned a workout or a school teacher scheduled a rehearsal, God was already in the business of strengthening his people through tough tests. He certainly did with Joseph. If you're just picking up on this study of Joseph, Joseph was 17 years of age when this Hebrew boy was dumped over the edge of a cistern and then pulled out, not to be saved, but to be sold into slavery and then taken into Egypt. He worked his way up the house of a man by the name of Potiphar, only to catch the eye of Mrs. Potiphar. And about the age of 27, she put the move on him, and he did the scoot out the door, only to be caught by Mr. Potiphar. And Mr. Potiphar, Joseph's master, took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And we wonder, since when does the high road lead off the cliff? All Joseph did was all he could. He did what was right. He did his best in Potiphar's house. Kept his nose clean, kept his bed made, got his chores done, and yet in spite of it all, he gets imprisoned with no hope of parole. Surely he was wondering, where in the world is God in this story? Maybe you're wondering that in yours. You know, you can do everything that's right, and life can turn out so wrong. Maybe you've made the right choices. You earned a degree, but now you can't find a job. Or you have a job, but the job is a dead-end cubicle. Or you took a stand for morality only to be dumped by a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Or you prayed for children, yet the womb is still empty. Or you raised a house full of kids, and now the house is empty. Life can feel like a prison. I'm thinking about a friend who, after a half-century of marriage, told me not long ago about his wife and how she has begun to lose her memory, and how earlier that week he had to go take her car keys from her. Half a century of marriage. He has to stay right close to her lest she fall. They had these hopes of growing old together, and well, they still will. It's just that only one of them will know what day of the week it is. How do we explain these occurrences in life? Carefully. Carefully. None of us know everything God is doing. None of us understand the full counsel or the full throttle of God's plan. Only God understands what he's doing. But we do know enough about God's character to know that his actions are never capricious, never callous, and they're never spontaneous. They have a purpose. Interestingly, that purpose, it seems more often than not, is explained in that four-letter word, test. This is some form of test. And this time in prison for Joseph was exactly that. If you like to fill in the blanks, here's the first line. God gave the test. Now, how can we be so sure that this time in which Joseph was in prison, how can we be so sure it was a test? Well, because the Bible tells us so. It's curious. It's a reference in the book of Psalms to Joseph. Psalm 105. You may have never seen this. Psalm 105, verses 18 and 19. There in prison, they bruised Joseph's feet with fetters, and they placed his neck in an iron collar until the time came to fulfill his word. Look, the Lord what? Tested Joseph's character. There it is in black and white. So we know, without a doubt, this time in prison was a time to test, train, mature, develop, strengthen, the character of Joseph. Joseph ended up in prison not because of Potiphar, but because of God. Part of the training of Joseph, part of the blueprint for Joseph's life, included a difficult stint in an Egyptian prison, a time in which God would test Joseph's character. It's not easy, nor is it always possible, to differentiate the difference between temptation and testing. But it seems that last week's message was a picture of temptation, of Satan trying to cause Joseph to stumble and fall. And this is a picture of testing, of God bringing a challenge to help Joseph stand strong. Satan wants to trip us up so we'll fall. God wants to test us so we'll be strong. Satan is always trumped by God, so even the temptations of Satan eventually become tests that strengthen us. And this, no doubt, is a test of God, intended to test or put some strength in the soul of Joseph. Early translations of Psalm 105 mistakenly translated the word neck as soul. And in some very, very ancient translations, none that you and I would purchase, but only that the scholars could find, this translation appears. They placed his soul in an iron collar. Later, when Jerome created the Latin translation of the Old Testament, he mistakenly inverted the subject and object of that very sentence, and he wrote, iron entered his soul. To this day, there are some old translations that have in the margin, you know those little tiny words in the margin next to a little tiny letter? There are some of those old translations that have the phrase, his soul came into iron. The translation is poor and long since been corrected, but the message is real, and that is, in the prison, God was depositing some iron in the soul of Joseph. This was a test. And when God gave the test, look what happened. Joseph passed it. Joseph passed the test. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever they did there, it was his doing. This was a test. Remember, God was looking for a man of high character to whom he could entrust the entire population of a soon-to-be famine-struck world. Now, where do you develop a character like that? Well, you might begin in Potiphar's household, in which for 10 years he oversaw the estate, of Potiphar. And then you might continue that training in an Egyptian prison. Because it's one thing to oversee the willing servants of Potiphar, it's something else entirely to oversee the unruly prisoners of an Egyptian prison. Now, at this point, when the prison warden came to Joseph, he could have just crossed his arms and he said, all right, you want me to head up this crew? You can forget it. I headed up the crew over there in Potiphar's house, and look what it got me. Prison stint. I'm just going to sit here and be quiet. But that's not what Joseph did. He didn't complain. He didn't criticize. He stayed positive. When he was given a task, he took it. You might say he passed the test. If you read the text, you know that two of the people in that prison came from the king's court, a butler and a baker. One morning, Joseph noticed that both men were sad. Again, Joseph could have dismissed their expressions. What concern was their sorrow to him? Who cares if they were sullen? Who cares if they were bitter? Joseph, however, took an interest in them. In fact, the first recorded words of Joseph in prison are terms of kindness. He said, "Why do you look so sad? Why do you look so sad?" I don't know about you, but I think compassion would be a suitable quality for somebody who's about to be put in charge of feeding the whole world. Joseph passed another test. When he saw a hurt, he addressed it. As the story goes on, the butler and the baker were disturbed by their dreams. In his dream, the butler saw a vine with 3 grape-bearing branches. He pressed the grapes and gave them to the king. The baker dreamed about the bread, 3 basketfuls on his head, and then they were eaten by the birds. Joseph listened to the dreams, and he told the butler, he said, well, I've got good news for you. He told the baker, he said, I've got bad news for you. To the butler, he said, you'll be out in 3 days. To the baker, he said, you'll be dead in 3 days. One gets a new start, the other gets a noose around the neck. Another test? Well, Psalm 105 said this is a test. Maybe the test was, could Joseph be trusted to share the news, both good and bad, if God gave it to him? If God told him to tell Pharaoh, you can expect 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine, could Joseph be trusted to deliver both the good news and the bad news? Apparently he could. Because when God gave him a message, he shared it. The good news with the butler, the bad news with the baker. Test, test, test. You know, this looks like a prison, doesn't it? Smells like a prison, sounds like a prison. But if you were to ask the angels who are looking down from heaven and say, where's Joseph? They would say, oh, he's in a testing time. And you? Maybe it looks like unemployment. Maybe it feels like rehab. Maybe it sounds like a hospital. But I'm wondering for some of you, if we could ask the angels, where is she? They would say, oh, she's in training right now. She's in a time of testing. Perhaps you have seen waiters or waitresses. Maybe you've even worn a little name tag that has your name, but then beneath it says, in training. God gives those out too. And he looks at us and he says, okay, it's time for a time of testing. It's time for a time of training. If you are in a time of training, a time of testing, then you've probably already had this thought, and that is, God must not love me anymore. He must not care for me anymore. He's turned away from me, because our initial reaction to a time of testing is we assume that means the absence of God, but just the opposite. He has his eye on you. He sees what you're going to need tomorrow, or what the kingdom is going to need tomorrow, and he gives it to you today by taking you through a time of testing. Did you know that the Hebrew word for test comes from a Hebrew verb that means to see or to look intently? So, to pass through a time of test is to be in the eye of God, in the gaze of God. Think about this. The creator of the universe has said, oh, I've got a special task for that person, so I'm going to pass them through a time of testing, so that when the test comes later, the strength will be there today. By the way, did God have the right to do this to Joseph? Change the question. Does God have the right to do this to you? He is the potter, and we are the clay, right? He is the shepherd, and we are He's the vine dresser, and we're the vine. He's the author, we're just the words. He's the teacher, we're just the student. He's the creator, we're the created. A good prayer for us to learn to pray is, God, do not stop this struggle until you have accomplished everything you want in my heart during this time of testing. Friend, you're going to get through this. You are. All tests are temporary. You'll get through this. I'm not saying it's going to be quick. No, I'm not saying it's going to be painless. But if God can make a prince out of a prisoner, if he can draw and hone a hero out of a hole, don't you think he can do something with this mess in which you find yourself? Of course he can. But in the meantime, you have to do your part. What's your part? Here it is. Take the test. How do you take the test? Well, I think we at least do what Joseph did, and that is, when you're given a task, take it. No task is too small. Do you aspire to do great things? Then show up on time. Do your work. Don't complain. God watches the way we do little tasks. If you're faithful over a few things, He'll set you over many. Did you notice that Joseph succeeded in the kitchen of Potiphar and the dungeon of Pharaoh before he succeeded as prime minister of Egypt? He cared for the butler and the baker before he cared for the nations. The reward of a good work is greater work. So do good work. Now's the time to just do good work. Let others bemoan the humble charge. Let others grumble in the corner of the prison cell. Not you. You know you're in a time of training. God is shaping your character. And today's slave is tomorrow's prime minister. So if you're given an humble task to do, do it. That's part of the training. And when you see a hurt, address it. We can only wonder, what if Joseph had ignored the sadness on the faces of the officers? What if he had ignored the butler and the baker? What if he said, I'm not going to talk to them? If you know how the story progresses, you know that it is the memory of the butler that serves to get Joseph out of prison. I hope I'm not giving away the end of the story to you. But if he had ignored the butler, then the butler would have had no memory of the kindness of Joseph. Yes, it was the kindness of Joseph that served as the key to open the door through which Joseph could pass. Kindness. What are you supposed to do during this tough time of testing? Well, I suggest you just be kind. It's no time for a pity party. Cancel the woe be me music. This is a time for service, not self-centeredness. And when God gives you a message to share, share it. Did you know, if you're in a test, let me just tell you, God has enrolled you in a postgraduate course of difficulty. And what you are learning in this postgraduate course of difficulty, you will someday teach to someone else. I know. You did not sign up for this course. I know. And I know it's a hard course. No one ever signs up for the course of single parenthood or caring for an aging parent or raising a handicapped child. You didn't sign up for it, but God signed you up for it. He's the maker. And He must think highly of you to give you this difficult assignment. God is the dean of the University of Hard Knocks. And He alone defines our curriculum. And sometimes He gives us these tough assignments so that we in turn can teach others. Have you ever seen this verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5? God comes alongside us when we go through hard times. And before you know it, He brings us alongside someone else who is going through hard times so that we can be there for that person just as God was there for us. Here's what I'm wondering. That maybe this tough time you're going through has nothing to do with you, but has something to do with someone else. So that when they go through it, you can give a word of encouragement to them. Henry Ward Beecher, celebrated preacher of over 100 years ago. Of the many stories he tells, I love the one in which he reflects on growing up in a very poor home. His father was a pastor just as he. He was raised in a family of 11 children, and the father was living or trying to live off of a salary of $800 a year. He remembers the poverty. He writes, how ministers ever lived in those times I cannot conceive. I remember that at the table one time my father was drinking his tea in his way, having poured it into a saucer to cool and then resting his two elbows on the table. Mother sat opposite, murmuring, in her sweet, refined, gentle, sad way, that the bills were due, that she had no money, that indeed she did not see how they could get along, that for her own part she expected to die in the poorhouse. At that, my father dropped his hand to the table, and his eyes sparkled. Something was coming. "My dear," he said, "I have trusted God now for 40 years, and he has never forsaken me. I am not going to begin to distrust him now." That woke me up. It was better than the catechism. It sank into me. And during my earlier life, when I went through similar perils of sickness and poverty and all forms of limitation and trouble, I never lost sight of that single scene. That sentence was never out of my ears. I trusted God for 40 years, and I'm not going to distrust him now. I wonder if the test of the Father wasn't for the sake of the Son. I wonder if the test of Elder Beecher wasn't for the sake of Beecher Jr., so that Beecher Jr. would remember the faith modeled for him by his father. And I wonder if your test isn't for someone else, so that that coworker, that neighbor, that wife, that child, that grandchild, somebody might see you suffer with dignity and nobility and remember how you modeled the message of God in their lives. Agnes did this. When Agnes was a young girl, she gave her heart to God, and she was on fire for her faith. She left her family, she left her home, even left her country. She became a missionary. She gave God everything, and in exchange, God gave her a test of loneliness. She felt as if God had left her. She wrote in her journal, "Deep down there is nothing but emptiness and darkness. My God, how painful is this unknown pain. I have no faith." But still she worked and served, and she even smiled. But on and off, for 50 years, she felt this depressing isolation, this secret pain. Only later in her life did she come to understand that this pain, like Joseph's prison, was a part of God's plan. She said this loneliness was her way to better understand, quote, "the hungry, the naked, the homeless, the crippled, the blind, the lepers, and all the people who feel unwanted." God was teaching her compassion so that she, Agnes, or we call her Mother Teresa, could have more compassion on the people for whom she cared. She came to see it as part of her call. Could I close by inviting you to do the same? See this time of testing not as an interruption to your life, but as preparation for your life. Not as a suggestion that God isn't here, but no, as proof that he is. Not as a question of your legitimacy, but as proof of your legitimacy. God does promise to use this mess for something good. This trouble you're in isn't punishment, it's training. The normal experience of children. God is doing what is